Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today I'm doing a collection guide on 40k as a whole. So, before we get into the specific factions, I just want to cover the golden rule of collecting Warhammer. Don't meta chase things. Now, not only does meta chasing make you unlikable to play against, but it will also drain your hobby willpower and your wallet, which is not good, and we certainly don't want that. Every unit in an army will usually have its time to shine, and having a well-rounded collection of one army will mean that no matter which way the meta shifts, you will have a place. In terms of collecting armies, though, there are three general steps that I do when I am collecting an army. So the first step is to pick up the basic troopers, whatever variant you may like, because these guys usually have a very standard appearance for the army as a whole, so they're a great way to test color schemes. Then I pick a character so I can start playing some mini-games with them, just whichever character you like the most, which is the main thing when it comes to collecting. And then I pick up a damage dealer unit, something like a Dreadnought as a general archetype, to add some muscle to the army, and then that should get you relatively close to 500 points, which is, of course, where most people will start playing games. And about combat patrols, I'd really only pick them up if you really enjoy all the models in the box. If not, they will just be a little overwhelming to paint, and you won't have fun doing it, and you may not even like playing the combat patrol game mode because they're not units you like. In terms of buying, there are a few tips because Warhammer is a pricey hobby. It always has been, and it always will be. So make sure to save $1 where you can. Here's my breakdown of the general places you can buy things from. GW themselves will often have, of course, the online exclusives and everything. They are very pricey, but their customer service is top-notch. The only couple times I've had issues, they have been very helpful and it's been very speedy to fix the issue that I had. Discount sellers are places like Amazon, certain shops on eBay like Flipside Gaming, or dedicated discount retailers like Dicehead and others. These offer a discount of 10 to 15%, which is amazing, of course, but it really does add up over an army to make a huge difference. I definitely do partake in these quite a lot. Second-hand models tend to be the cheapest sometimes, though they are often assembled and painted, but that's sort of the trade-off. You have to do some extra work for them once you get them. Make sure to evaluate any listings just to make sure you're not getting fleeced or if the effort's worth it. And then local stores, you do want to buy stuff here. Remember, keep your local stores alive or the hobby becomes a whole lot harder to do. I do about 2/3 shopping online and 1/3 shopping in store. Overall, just make sure you're supporting your local game store, however it may be. We want them to stay in business, everybody. Not everyone has the luxury, so make sure you enjoy it while you can. A quick note on 3D printing, so before you go down into the comments and leave a snarky little comment about just buying a printer, I do want to make it known that depending on people's living situations, buying a printer is not always just the easiest option, as people often make it sound, and handling resin should not be taken so lightly. Unless you plan on having several armies at a huge scale, I would not recommend a printer, though buying printed models I think is totally fine and totally reasonable off of websites like Etsy, especially for poor value kits like Mega Knobs. Now, that's going to be sort of the end of our 3D printing discussion, because in reality, you could apply all of these, but just swap out the names of the units for whatever 3D printed proxy you're using, and don't use recasts. Those are, not cool. Don't use recasts. Space Marines are many people's first army, and while their combat patrol is alright, I don't think it's the best, so I wanted to give a slightly alternative way. The first unit I would get is Intercessors of any flavor, Assault, Normal, or Heavy. These guys are, of course, your basic grunts. They'll always have a place in an army. They're very easy to paint and very easy to build, so very useful for just planning out your color scheme. And then I'd actually recommend the Company Heroes, which gives you a captain and then the Company Heroes unit. They're all fun to paint, and interestingly, once you've sort of grown past this phase, you can use the Ancient and the Champion as their own characters. The Ancient, of course, can just be an Ancient, and the Champ could easily pass for a Lieutenant, which makes this a great value kit just to get some characters early and to also future-proof your army, because, of course, having to buy extra characters is never all that fun. And then in terms of the muscle choice, in my opinion, the Redemptor Dreadnought is great. This could be subbed for any sort of unique unit, as this is chapter, this doesn't align to any chapter. You could swap this out for, say, Deathwing Knights, but we're talking just generic choices. Or any other veterans, really. But most Marine players do enjoy Dreads because Dreadnoughts are very cool, and this guy offers very good shooting in melee. Overall, this would be a very fine starter army, and would get you a long way for a decently long while. Next up are the Grey Knights. which if you like the Grey Knights as a faction, it's pretty impossible to say you should get anything other than the Combat Patrol because it contains all 3 of their core kits. So I would always get the Combat Patrol, so start there. But past that, or if you want to start differently, another box of Marines or Terminators is a great way to start out, or to expand on your Combat Patrol. And then beyond that, it's sort of just buying the same things over and over again. Though, if you did want to go down something a little more unique, you could go, for example, Calor Drago, who is he's a classic character that has been in the lore for a decent amount of time, and he acts as a nice buffer for Terminators most of the time, and he does a lot of damage. He's a good fighter. In general, he's a fine choice, though beyond that, there isn't too much more to say. Honestly, you could get duplicates of the Grey Knights Combat Patrol. Getting 2 of those would give you a very solid amount of your army, as well as giving you the muscle. From the Dread Knight, the sort of general elite melee of the Terminators, and then of course you have your Strike Marines, which of course make up the sort of backbone of your army. They do the grunt work, while also having their psychic powers and shenanigans. Overall, there's not much to say about collecting Grey Knights, because there's not that many Grey Knights to collect. Though, I did want to include them anyways, because obviously they can't use the same stuff that the normal Space Marines can use. Next are the Sisters of Battle, or the Adepta sororitas rather, who I still think have a very solid Combat Patrol. However, I'm not the biggest fan of the Arco-Flagellants look, so getting them for free in the Combat Patrol isn't that interesting to me. Here's what I would do if I wasn't super Jones to buy that box. First off, you start with Sisters of Battle. Again, you'll be hard-pressed to find a unit you will use more frequently than just your standard Sisters, and they lay the groundwork for the aesthetic of the entire army, and will be very useful most of the time, and will be useful in the hobby sense to let you practice your color schemes. And then in terms of a character, it's kind of hard to go wrong with the Canoness. Any of the Canoness would work, but she's a generic HQ choice that will see use in pretty much every battle, so long as you aren't running a strange skew list. And then in terms of third, the Sisters have quite a few units that I think would work as sort of the muscle. Paragon suits are tough and have good shooting in melee. Sacrosancts lean more into melee and toughness. The Jump Pack Sisters aren't very tough, but they do pack quite a bit of power. The Zephyrim or the Seraphim is what I'm talking about. And then, if you wanted to go more classic, the Retributors are a great choice as well, because they, of course, can destroy vehicles very efficiently, which is something that the rest of your army so far would generally struggle to do. Though, I think any of these choices are fine, and their Combat Patrol is still good. Next are the Custodes. The Custodes have a perfect Combat Patrol, much like the Grey Knights, including all of their main core kits. I would highly recommend this. And the Combat Patrol will form a little under half of your army. If you build the characters out of the squads, it will form at least half your army. In terms of a secondary choice, I think jet bikes are very useful. The extra speed is very useful for an army that's traditionally very slow, but if you do like the Sisters of Silence aesthetic, I suppose they're a fine choice, though I'm not the biggest Sisters fan, so I'm not exactly the authority on that. From that point, you'll have just about everything in the army, really. You could just pick up Trajan Valoris, and I suppose Illyrian and Valyrian and Alea, and you would have the entire plastic range of Custodes. Really, their Combat Patrol just goes such a long way on making this army very collectible, very easy to collect, even more so than Custodes traditionally are. In general, just sort of pick a Custodian unit you really like, and then sort of just bulk out your army with more copies of that. And then, as I mentioned, if you do like the Sisters, bring the Sisters, and jet bikes are fine for utility, as well as they tend to be quite good for the Custodes historically. Anyways, there's not too much to say about the Custodes, because there's not too many Custodes to collect. Similar thing with the Grey Knights, with these golden guys. Next up are the Mechanicus. The Mechanicus Combat Patrol is fairly middle of the road in my opinion, and I'm not a big fan of the flyers or the horses, but here's the route that I would take if I was going to collect the Mechanicus. First up, the Skitarii Rangers are the standard infantry of the AdMech and look really cool, so I definitely would want a healthy contingent of them, and in this edition at least, the army tends to benefit from having them around. In terms of the second choice, I would pick your favorite tech priest. For me, I quite like the Dominus. I think he looks quite spooky and cool, so I'd go with him, though I believe the Manipulus or the Engine Seer is fine depending on your choice of elites. And then speaking of, the Cataphrons and Castellans both add damage. The Cataphrons do it more so at range, and the Castellans offer up more melee damage. In terms of what I would pick, it would be the Castellans, mainly because I just like the way they look. If preferring a more traditional vehicle that may be more in line with the AdMech's sort of original or standard look, I think the Onager Doomcrawlers are very good, just not only as mobile little weapon platforms, but also just a good way to bulk out an army, as they are, quite decently sized, and they have a large amount of weaponry, which is of course useful. That can go a long way when you give it certain buffs. Next, we have the Agents of the Imperium, which function much like a soup army. They take options from various armies, but still, if you like the Arbides aesthetic, go with the Combat Patrol because it includes a lot of them, but if you prefer more Death Watch, though, you'll need a different approach. In terms of first, I'd say all three of their battle line options, either the Arbites, Death Watch Veterans, or Navy Breachers, are all solid options depending on the vibe you want to go for. Again, I'm not super familiar with Agents of the Imperium, but still, this is off my sort of general rules of thumb. I think an Inquisitor or Watchmaster are both solid leaders, or any of the named Inquisitors, really. I think the normal Inquisitor and the Watchmaster both have the benefits of being generic characters, and they also do lead very potent units for the most part. And then, of course, the named Inquisitors do have their sort of unique things where they have their damage buffs against certain targets. And then in terms of a more elite damage dealer unit, I think the main option is the Grey Knights Terminators. With their abilities, they're really the only thing that can deal with solid armor this edition, which is very important to deal with, and I believe these guys are the best to do it for the Agents of the Imperium as they are. However, if you wanted to keep in the Imperial Agent theme, I suppose an Eversor or Vindicare Assassin can certainly put the hurt on the enemy. These are, of course, just my thoughts. Next up are the Astra Militarum, or more commonly known as the Imperial Guard. I'd say their combat patrol is also fairly middle of the pack, and I wouldn't generally go with that, but I do think you should use third-party infantry just because most of the lists will be running a lot of them from, say, Wargames Atlantic or Printed. I think both of these are good, but I still use official vehicles. In terms of my first choice, it's kind of hard to not just pick the infantry of your choice, whether that be Catachans, Cadians, or Death Corps of Krieg, or whatever regiment you want to use. They all have their own valid playstyles, so just pick whichever you think looks the nicest, and then use the rules you want to. And then in terms of the second option, I'd say a command squad is always going to serve you well. Command squads have always been sort of a staple of the Imperial Guard, and I don't think that's going to change in this edition, or the next edition in the future. They, of course, also come with a few more models to paint up, which is always useful, just to increase your painting skills. And then, obviously, I think this is a obvious choice, but for the third one would be a tank of some variety. Either one of the pricier Lehman Russes or a Rogel Dorn I think would do just fine. These both have their toughness and add a lot of firepower to it. However, if for some reason you're playing Guard and don't want to use a lot of tanks, Khazar can make good infantry damage dealers and will be pretty solid in that role. Next, we have the Imperial Knights, who I can't really tell you much about these guys just because of the way their army functions. Just pick up either a large knight or 2 armigers, get them painted up before buying any more. You will have a small army right away, and of course knights in general are quite easy to collect and are quite fun to paint, so there's not much else I can add on to that. And when you build your knight, I do recommend magnetizing it, or, of course, if you don't have magnets or can't be bothered, just build it with whichever set of arms you think look the coolest. There's really not that much in it. This also applies for the Chaos Knights. They won't be getting their own section because they're just Imperial Knights but painted slightly differently. Next up, we have our first Chaos Army, the Chaos Demons. If you like Khorne, just get the Combat Patrol. It's a great Khorne offering, and will offer you multiple units that do various things that are, of course, very useful. But for the other 3 gods, I have a fairly standard guide. For the lesser demons, I'd just pick whichever one you want for your favorite flavor of Chaos God, whether that be Plague Bearers, the 3 kinds of Horrors, Demonettes, or Bloodletters. Really, all 4 of them have their place, and all 4 of them serve their purpose. I'd recommend getting one of the middle demons for your next purchase, whether that be Flamers for Tzeentch, Beasts or Plague Drones for Nurgle, Fiends or Seekers for Slaanesh, or Blood Crushers for Khorne, of course. This, of course, gives your army more melee prowess, as well as being a little faster, and in general just more efficient in terms of dealing damage than the lesser demons are. Now, if you're feeling confident for your third option, I think it's a pretty standard guess to just get one of the greater demons. These guys are always going to be centerpieces of an army and add a lot of points and muscles to a list no matter which one you pick. However, I suppose if you weren't feeling that, you could go down the route of maybe picking up a demon prince if you wanted to go with something slightly less major than a full-on greater demon, or maybe you just want to get the heralds of whatever god your army is building, or if you're building soup, whichever heralds you want. Next up, we have the Chaos Space Marines, who have a solid combat patrol, but not everyone wants to run Possessed or even Cultists. First pick is obvious. Legionaries are a great kit and unit, and these guys will always be a solid unit in your army to run as just a backbone and overall muscle unit for doing objectives. In terms of secondary, I'd think any of the characters are a fine option, though I would try and align it whichever damage dealer you want to get for your step 3, though a classic Lord is very, very difficult to go wrong with, and same thing with the Terminator Lord or the Jump Pack Lord. In terms of Step 3, all the Chaos Elites are very solid units, my favorite are Terminators personally, and pair well with their specific characters, whether that be Possessed with Master of Possession, Terminators with Terminator Lords, or even Abaddon, and then Chosen with a Chaos Lord. However, if you wanted to go for more demon engines, the Defiler does pack a lot of varied weapons, or a Demolisher does sort of fulfill the role of standard tank alongside the Predator Destructor. Both of those would be fine options for some extra damage, as well as not going too heavily into the demon aesthetic. If you're playing someone like Iron Warriors, it does make sense that you wouldn't be using too many demon-infused or whatever it may be units. Though, as I mentioned, the Chaos roster is pretty well-rounded, so you can pretty much pick whatever you want after you get your Legionary fix. Death Guard are up next, and they have one of my most hated combat patrols. If you really enjoy the zombies, though, it is a fine choice, though it's just not really to my tastes. The Plague Marines are going to be a staple in just about every army, and in most lists. They pack quite a bit of power with their varied melee weapons and plague guns, and will be useful as long as Death Guard are useful pretty much. Then, for my HQ choice, I would go with a Lord of Contagion, who is a powerful leader for Terminators, and I'm a well-known and outspoken Terminator lover, so this iconic unit to the Death Guard, that was one of their first new models when they got brought back, is certainly going to be getting support for a long time, and will in general be kept in quite a strong place, as so long as Terminators are kept strong, which they tend to be for the Death Guard. The Death Shroud are the obvious choice. They are hard to go wrong with, they just hit really hard with their big man Reapers, and they are quite tough, especially in 10th edition. They can really put the hurt on with a Lord of Contagion with them, as their man Reapers do have those lethal hits, and just about everything is not going to want to get hit by those, because, you know, they're big scythes that can wound just about anything in the game. Though I suppose if you wanted a different option, I suppose you could go with Blight Lords, who are a little tougher, they'll have less damage, but in my opinion do look cooler. Or just more Plague Marines, I suppose. Next up, we have the Thousand Sons, who have my most hated combat patrol, so we're going to do something a little more traditional for the Thousand Sons. Rubrics are, of course, the backbone of any army and have a lot of nice detail, and they're super fun to paint, in my opinion. From there, after you get your Rubric Marines done and painted up, I'd recommend getting the box of Exalted Sorcerers, which comes with 3 of them. It's going to offer you a lot of magic power and all the sorcerers you'll really need, and is certainly a staple in any Thousand Sun force worth its salt. In terms of damage dealers, the Thousand Suns sort of have a Grey Knight situation going on where they don't actually have that many kits. The Scarab Occult Terminators, though, do make up your sort of elite damage dealers who pack a lot of weaponry with their Soul Reaper cannons and missile racks. They also come with their swords that do quite a bit of damage, and while they won't have a leader from the box of Exalted Sorcerers, that would be a totally fine pick for your next upgrade if you wanted to get a Sorcerer in Terminator armor. However, with the Thousand Suns, you will generally just kind of want to pick up boxes of these over and over again, because the Thousand Suns lack really any other kits outside of Magnus the Red and that one, the guy that uses trickery. I can't remember his name right now. Regardless, that's my guide on how I would collect the Thousand Suns. Next up, we have the World Eaters, which are one of the best when it comes to combat patrols, and if you're playing World Eaters, chances are you'll want all the units included, because it includes so many Khorne Berserkers, which are of course the backbone of any army, and even if you don't start with that, you will want to start with Berserkers, because they are the unit for the World Eaters, and they will be good pretty much all the time. They'll hit really hard and do their job. From there, I'd say the Lord on Juggernaut, who can be built as Lord Invocatus, is a good option, but he's of course included in the Combat Patrol as well, so again, I would just go with the Combat Patrol. In terms of the elite damage dealers, There is, of course, Angron, who is, a good choice if you're feeling very confident, and he does do a lot in-game, but still you may want to use something a little less high intensity, like the 8-bound, who do carry a lot of powerful weapons, and they can be led by the Juggernaut Lords, both the generic one and Lord Invocatus, for whichever you want to use, and Lord Invocatus can make a really, really effective leader for your army in general, just because of the benefits he gives to movement, which he did last edition and in this edition. Overall, I would say just start with the Combat Patrol, though. Getting all those Khorne Berserkers, the Jackals are nice grunts, and of course you get Lord Invocatus in there as well. The Eldar have a pretty top-tier Combat Patrol in my opinion, but if you're not a big jet bike fan, you may want to go down a different path. Guardians in general tend to make good grunts for the Eldar, and the kit also comes with a lot of bits that are useful for converting things that are still in resin. For example, fire dragons come to mind at first. And then in terms for your second option, I believe it's quite obvious. You'll want to go with either an Autarch or a Farseer. They both do well and have done well throughout the game's history, and I'd eventually get both. However, I would pick up whichever I think looks cooler for the first one. For me personally, that was getting an Autarch first because I really like the Autarch kit. It's very cool and it comes with a lot of extra nice bits for some extra weaponry. And then in terms of your damage dealer, the variety that the Eldar have is truly staggering, so it's really up to taste. Any of the Aspects warriors could do good work, but if you wanted something that is a little bit more durable, you'll want to go with the Wraith constructs, whether that be Wraith Blades, Wraith Guard, or even a Wraith Lord, who packs quite a bit of anti-tank with his shoulder-mounted weapons and has quite good melee as well. Overall, though, the Eldar have some of the most options in the game, which of course does make sense. They are very popular and have been for the game's entirety of its existence, and most of these units have seen good use throughout this game's entire existence, just as the Eldar have. Next up are the Drukhari, who have the best Combat Patrol in my opinion. If you like the vibe of Drukhari, you'll like the Combat Patrol. Unless you really want to only go down one of the aesthetics, I would pick it up. The Combat Patrol is what you should buy first, though if you did want to go down a different path, the Witches or the Racks for the Witch Cults and the Homunculus Covens, I believe they're called, are both totally fine options and do have the hallmark designs of the Drukhari, so they are quite good for getting your painting skills up. In terms of the secondary choice, I would pick your favorite leader of the groups. If you bought the Combat Patrol, you already have an Archon, so don't get another Archon, but whether that be a Succubus or a Homunculus for whatever you want to rerunning as your secondary damage dealer, or even Lilith Hesperax, for example, this would be the next thing I would pick up. And then in third place, we have the Incubi, who are really good for dealing damage, which is another reason that the Combat Patrol is so good. But the other option would be a Ravager, which is also included in the Combat Patrol. The Drukhari have a really, really good Combat Patrol. As much as I'd want to come up with a different list, I can't really do one feasibly because the Drukhari Combat Patrol is already so good. So yeah, if you're interested in them, pick that up before it's gone, and you certainly will not regret it. Next are the Genestealer cults, who have a fairly mid-combat patrol, which is not particularly to my tastes. We're going to take a look at a different path. So firstly, we will want to start off with Neophytes, who make not only great models, but they are good for doing the grunt work of the army, which is always useful to have as a beginning point. My choice for HQ would be the Biophagus, but a Primus for hybrids and a Patriarch for Genestealers are both good choices in my opinion, and actually you get the Primus and the Patriarch together, so really there isn't too much of a reason to not have both if you are going to run them. Though the third option does depend on what you choose for a leader. For me, obviously I like the Biophagus, which obviously leads the Aberrants, which would be quite a tough and melee-focused unit, though the Patriarch leads the Genestealers, who tend to have very high AP melee that is sort of middling in strength, though with his buffs they are quite devastating. And then the Primus himself can lead the hybrids, is a fun way to have a sort of jump out of reserves and throw a bunch of bombs at the enemy, and tend to be a core unit to the army, so not too bad to have all three of these at some point, but as a starting point I would just pick one elite unit, one leader, to have as your main damage dealer, and in my opinion my favorite are the Biophagus and his Aberrants. Though all three options are very good, all fantastic models, and I quite like them all. That's why Genestealer cults are so tempting. Next are the Space Dwarves of the Leagues of Votan, who have another solid combat patrol, though some people may prefer other damage dealers to the Berserkers, though their small range does mean that there's going to be a lot of overlap. In terms of your first choice, Hearthkin Warriors, of course, they do all the things troops do. They hold objectives well, they set the groundwork for what the army is supposed to look like, and are very good models that are fun to paint. Second, I would recommend picking up either a Carl or a Brokir's Ironmaster, depending on how you want to deal your damage, whether that be at melee or at range. So the Hearthguard are definitely the main melee damage dealers, and they like the Call with them, and the Thunderkin are more ranged focused, though they both bring a lot to the table and are likely to be the main options in these slots for quite a while. Me personally, I prefer the Brokir Ironmaster and Brokir Thunderkin, just because I think those models look so sick, and I love seeing them blow up vehicles with pretty, relative ease. In terms of what I would equip them with, that's not really what this video is talking about, but the Grav Cannons are super fun and in general do quite a lot of damage against their intended targets, which can be very useful for the Leagues of Votan as they tend not to be very tough, so need to destroy their enemies before the enemies get to destroy them. Anyways, I would say though their combat patrol is a fine choice for a starting point. Next up are the Necrons, who do have a great combat patrol that offers you a very well-rounded force, and honestly, it's going to be hard to make a better starting force than that because it really includes everything. Necron warriors are very common second hand, so it is easy to bulk up on them, though they're of course already included in the combat patrol. Second, an Overlord is a solid HQ and has been for as long as Necrons have been around, and will always have a place in the army, so really, again, the combat patrol stays a very, very solid option. And then third, surprisingly enough, the Canoptic Doomstalker offers really good firepower against vehicles, or you could swap that out for a Doomsday Ark if you don't just want to get the combat patrol, but do it in smaller bits, I guess. Though if you are more of a melee damage unit, or a fan, like me personally, Scorpec Destroyers can do a lot of damage up close and personal, but if you notice something, I just described the combat patrol as probably being the best starter army for the Necrons you can have, because that combat patrol gives you a little bit of everything. It gives you chaff with the Canoptic Scarabs. It gives you warriors, which are good for doing objectives and shooting at infantry. It gives you the Canoptic Doomstalker, which is really good for shooting at enemies, shooting at tanks mainly. And then the Scorpec Destroyers, of course, do a lot of melee damage and are quite ferocious, and they're pretty speedy as well. Overall, just get the combat patrol for the Necrons. Next up, we have the Orks, who do have a good combat patrol if you like the Beast Snagga's aesthetic, which I do enjoy, but I am definitely more of a fan to the more traditional Ork aesthetic. So in that way, we're going to go down a slightly different path that's more traditional of their old box and also their old start collecting. Boys, of course, make up the core of any good Ork list, and will always be useful just to either slow enemies down, to kill enemies really efficiently, or just to be grunts to do objectives that are a little tougher than your normal Gretchen. As I mentioned, any good list doesn't leave home without some boys. I'd recommend picking up a War Boss next, just because the War Boss is always and will always be a very fighty character that will serve you well and is very, very dependable, and synergizes very well with both boys, and one of the options we have for number 3, which will be Knobs. Knobs are really good at just foot-bound melee bruisers with their big power claws, and their kit is really fun. I really enjoy building and painting Knobs. Though if you want something that's a little more stompy, I would recommend Def Dread, which is generally just a tough melee vehicle that has the options to do a lot of different things, though in general you will see most of them with just 4 claws, and it is a really fun unit that I have a huge soft spot for just because it is an orky dreadnought, which is very cool. Next up, the Tau have a very solid core combat patrol, so that's a good place to start, and I'll cover expansions for the combat patrol as well as a slightly different list that you can work towards. Regardless for both, Fire Warriors are a per usual great first kit. They're not too bad to put together, and building them as either Breachers or Strike Team is, of course, totally up to you, which you find cooler. Me personally, I prefer the Breachers. I like the look of their neutron carbines. And then in terms of secondary, for combat patrol buyers, I'd go with the units of Crisis Suits ASAP, because you want someone to join up with that Crisis Commander, which is, of course, very useful. And those who are inclined to go without the patrol, a Cadre Fireblade is a good leader for any army and synergizes well with the infantry we just bought. And then finally, for combat patrol buyers, you may like to add something like Stealth Suits or a Ghost Keel for utility, And for non-combat patrol buyers, I'd recommend buying something like a Hammerhead, which offers a lot of anti-tank damage and will round out your little mini list very efficiently. However, I would highly suggest getting the Combat Patrol unless you aren't a big fan of battle suits, but then I sort of question why you're playing Tau at all if you don't want to use the thing the Tau are most known for, even though I know the Hammerhead does have its storied history of being very, very powerful. Next, we have the Tyranids, who have a fairly standard combat patrol for those who like the more hoardy aspect of the Tyranids, but I will give some alternative options. So even in Nidzilla lists, I would still start with some Hormagaunts or Termagants because they are both useful for objectives, and in general they have that little bit of extra mobility that monsters tend not to have, and they also made good units to make your paint scheme on, which the Tyranids are very fun to do so I would definitely try a couple different paint schemes on the Tyranids that you do have. In terms of characters, I'd really just recommend a Hive Tyrant, who is probably the most storied leader of the Tyranids in general. They pack guns and good melee, and you will rarely go wrong with bringing a Hive Tyrant along. And then in terms of the final one, the Haruspex is quite a fun model that packs a lot of power and tends to be effective against most targets, though another option is the Tyrannifex, which packs its huge gun, which is more useful for things at range, and it is very, very tough, and is surprisingly cheap in terms of money for its size, which is definitely a nice benefit, as obviously we're always looking to save a little bit of money when we're making our army, and the Tyrannifex is, I believe, the best points value for money that the Tyranids have access to, even accounting for some of the newer discount kits. So that covers all the main factions in 40k. Then from there, as you expand your army, really I would just repeat the cycle of getting a sort of bread and butter unit you will use a lot, and then if you have any character slots left, get a character, and then from there pick up a damage dealing unit. Of course, once you max out on any of those slots, you can simply double up on another slot, say 2 damage units per cycle instead of just 1. However, I would also start to look towards utility units. This would be things like Space Marine Scouts, or even Tyranid, what are they called? Harpies. Or not Harpies, what are they? Gargoyles, sorry. And the main thing that you should keep in mind is never buy more than you need, because you will get overwhelmed and you will not paint as much, and then you will only grow your gray horde even more. So make sure to buy stuff, paint it, and then buy more stuff. If you keep up this cycle of not buying anything new until you've already painted everything, I assure you, you will have significantly more fun with this hobby than if you start to get a huge gray horde of plastic that will take you forever to get through, or at least it seems like it, which means you will never start and you will never get anywhere. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.